So this brings us to part 2 of communicating emotions from my interpersonal communication class. This is Professor Barry Brennan. I'm going to go straight to where we left off. We were talking about the influences on emotions such as culture, gender, social context, or convention, um, different types of culture, collectivistic, individualistic, right? All those ways that influence how we interpret emotion, how we express our emotion, our personality. That's the obvious one, right? Where do we get that from? So let's take a look. Here we are. We're going to go to this slide right there. Start right there. So I want you to think about, I asked you this before, we talked about those 6 different emotions, which was happiness, anger, sadness, disgust, fear, and surprise, right? 6 emotions. And here on, what do you think for you, if you were going to do a free write on this, what would be the communication, excuse me, the emotions that you find yourself being particularly maybe comfortable with, right? The ones that you experience often. There's certain things, let me put it this way. In psychology, I've learned that the way our brains work, the emotions and thought patterns create actually grooves in our brain, in the electrical pathways in our brain. And so if we have a certain feeling that it happens over and over again, it's like our go-to. So that's what I mean. What kind of emotions are you predisposed to? Like, I'll give you an example for me. There was a time in my life that I was really predisposed to being depressed. And certain things would trigger it. That's a good word. Would trigger that emotion. And I go through the same path and the same feelings that I would go through self-hate, self-loathing, wanting to being suicidal, all this part of my depression. Okay? And that became, because I felt it over and over again, that became part of my brain chemistry, or the pathways in my brain. Now, if you keep using those pathways, they become pathways like roads. And you can, this is the beautiful thing, is that's why affirmations and other things, positive things, if you want to change the way you think about something, it actually works because you're creating new neural pathways in your brain. So coming back to this, what particular emotions do you think you're predisposed to? There's no right or wrong answer. There's no need to feel ashamed about anything. It all is what it is. There's no right or wrong. You don't have to be happy all the time or ecstatic uh, or if you're, a lot of times you're afraid. Okay, this is just about you trying to understand what you're about. Also give you some more words for this particular, when we talk about emotions. Okay, categories of predispositions. So a lot of us are predisposed to have a particular predisposition to a certain way of feeling about things. Okay, personality traits, as we say, that influence your emotions. Now, if you're a person that is generally apprehensive about communicating, which means kind of fearful about communicating, so that affects obviously your willingness to communicate. If you're a person that likes the attention, likes to express themselves, what we call more of a communicator style, then you might be more easygoing about yourself and how you communicate. And maybe you have a better, I don't want to say better, like you have a sense of humor about yourself. You don't take yourself too seriously. If you're adaptive, like you find a way to, you communicate depending upon who you're involved with, like in your personality. If you're more chameleon-like you have a personality in one situation, this is your personality. In another situation, you communicate this way. If that's kind of who you are, you can be different in different situations, then you have more of an effective orientation. And how you interact with others, your involvement with others, and your relationships with others determine how you communicate and what emotions you express. Now, if you have a tendency to be, we call aggressive, but to be more assertive and authoritative in the way you communicate, you might be seen as someone who's verbally aggressive or argumentative. You're just someone who, maybe you're the devil's advocate. That's your personality style. Like that, then how you communicate can come across more aggressive. And I want to be clear that there could be some bias in the way this is also proposed, because there's cultural bias, and we see oftentimes in African American people, in communication styles in African American people, there's a certain communication style that's maybe louder, might be seen as more aggressive, but it's just a more theatrical, boisterous way of communicating than maybe if you're an Asian person or if you're white, and also class has to do with it, all that. So keep that in mind when you're thinking about what influences your communication style and your perception about it, right? How you perceive it and how that person might perceive their communication style. So we're going to get into this a little deeper. So if you're kind of apprehensive about talking to people, then that's going to affect how you express your feelings, right? You're probably going to be a little more closed down. Let's talk about this a little bit. If you are more apprehensive, you have a harder time making friends with people. When you do make friends, you're able to talk. You could also be kind of introverted too, but you might be apprehensive. You might feel like it's harder for you to talk to people, but that also can end up being a self-fulfilling prophecy, right? It can end up being like this thing where, and we talked about that in perception, where if you think it's going to happen and you end up making it so because you feel that about yourself. So if you're apprehensive, sometimes that can work against you, right? So being cautious is not a bad thing. So maybe you want to work on being maybe cautious and less fearful. That's what I would say. Because we do all need relationships, and the negative of that is feeling isolated and feeling alone. And all of us need each other, right? Some people need more people in their life and some people need less, but we do need other human beings. Now, if your style is more, you're about making an impression on people, you like to get involved. When we say human orientation is you don't take yourself too seriously and you have a pretty good sense of humor. Maybe you like to clown around. There's also negatives of this in terms of your self-expression. You could be seen as kind of a dominant person. And sometimes when you're like that all the time, you might come across as kind of superficial. So, but this again, we're talking about personality predispositions. Who are you more predisposed to be like? And again, those other factors, gender, culture, all influence, class, social class, age, all these things influence like your personality predisposition. I used to be a much more apprehensive person, and when I got older, I became less. I think I'm probably more presentation style. Okay. All right. Moving along. Adaptation. Do you go with the flow and think about what's going on with people and fit into the situation? Is your orientation more about figuring out what's happening in the situation or the friendship circle or the family environment and finding out what's appropriate in that situation and how to act? Okay, and adaptation, if that's kind of just the way you are. So you're kind of have this one personality with your friends, you have another personality with your family, you have a different personality when you're at school. So you could be the type of person that's highly not category, but yeah, kind of are able to box those things, right? Have these different roles, and you adapt in different situations to different ways because different situations call out different things, right? Now, if your style is really to be more, I don't want to even say you could be destructive. You could be a person that's an angry person in general. I haven't really met any of my students that are like that in general, but you could be argumentative, um, and just kind of definitely, and the cost of being argumentative is that you make people defensive, right? There's a cost to it. But also playing the devil's good advocate, we can learn from people that are argumentative. Their style might be less mm, less diplomatic, but it also serves a purpose. Okay, so this means that you have your personality, you have a tendency to engage forcefully, and it can end up being kind of destructive. So just keep that in mind. But you can also be assertive. It doesn't have to be destructive. So think about all these personality predispositions and how they influence how you express your emotions and your emotions in your relationships with others. All right. How do we manage difficult emotions? So first we have to distinguish between what we call facilitative and debilitative emotions. Facilitative are emotions that propel us forward, okay? Help us feel energized, get things done. Usually positive, happiness, elation. But we don't also want to be so high, because oftentimes if we're way too high about something, a low is coming, okay? What we want to do is find a balance, but also being able to distinguish between what emotion is going to help propel us forward and what emotion is going to stop us. Debilitative means something that stops us in our tracks. We're going to talk about this. We're going to have you watch this assignment, this TED Talk by Brene Brown. It's called The Power of Vulnerability. And she talks a lot about, we often think about vulnerability as fear or something negative, right? When we talk about being vulnerable, we don't want to be vulnerable. But what she's going to talk about is vulnerability is the birthplace of all creativity, of all innovation, of all things that are powerful and have the ability to make change. That's where vulnerability is the birthplace of those things. And she's going to talk about what it is as us as a culture, and mostly as people, and what we've learned about not being about being vulnerable and how we might want to change our view about that. And so finding when we have emotions, asking ourselves, is this going to facilitate what I need to get done, or is this going to debilitate me? There are times for grief when someone dies, when you've lost a relationship, when your pet dies, right? When you've lost a job that you loved, when your house burned to the ground, right? And I haven't even seen it. Maybe when you've had an accident, you've lost a limb, or when you had to give something up in order to get something else. There are times for grief. There are times for sadness. And sadness is facilitative when it moves us through something. It becomes debilitative when it stops us and into depression. And that's where you want to be able to find which is what. Is it facilitating my growth as a person, or is it stopping my growth as a person? That's what it means to be. Is it facilitative, or is it debilitative.